Do you like candles? We all know that I love candles, and I love the candles from Remy Moon. They are an Australian-based small business and they make the best and most magical candles. All of their candles are made with high vibes, pure intentions, and each one is crafted with a little bit of Reiki healing that also suits the intention of the candle itself. All their candles are non-toxic and vegan, so they don't harm us or the animals. You can use the code Suburban Witch for 15% off all of their products, and it's only for listeners of the Witch Talks podcast. Simply head to remymoon.com.au to get your candles now. Welcome to Witch Talks, the series for spiritual seekers, witches, and enlightened souls. I'm Hana the Suburban Witch, professional tarot reader, astrologer, and witch, and I hope you're ready to get up close and personal with your favourite witches. Hello everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of the Witch Talks podcast. I am so glad to have you here. My name is Hana O'Neill, also known as Hana the Suburban Witch, and I am your lovely host for this podcast. Now, today's guest, Matthew, he is one of the rare guests of mine who does not identify as a witch. However, his topic of interest, his topic of speciality is very relevant for a lot of us. So we're going to jump straight into it because he explains it way better than I could. And then I'm actually going to come back in the end and bring it back to a couple of people in our own community where I have seen things like this happening. And just super quickly, I promise we're about to get started, just letting you know, I have an Instagram just dedicated to this podcast. It is at Witch Talks podcast. I would love to see you over there. I share lots of clips and videos and pictures and things from our guests and the things that they're sharing and talking about. And if you're listening to this close to when it actually releases, my upcoming class is on candle magic. It's happening on the winter solstice for those in the southern hemisphere, which will be the summer solstice for those of you in the northern hemisphere. And that is happening on Wednesday, June 21st here in Australia, which will be the evening of Tuesday, June 20th, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. Make sure to snap up your ticket before they go. You can purchase the live option for $80 Australian, or you can simply get the replay only if you can't join us live, and that is $70 Australian. Big reminder though to all of those people in the States and Europe, with the exchange rate, that almost halves. So you guys are pretty lucky. So join me in a couple of days' time for the secrets of candle magic, and we're going to go right into it. There's going to be a Q&A. It will be wonderful. This class is back by popular demand because you guys, everyone really loved it last time. It was really awesome. So hope to see you there. Now, let's go over to Matthew. Enjoy. In this episode, I am chatting with Matthew Remski about the New Age to alt-right pipeline. Matthew is a former yoga teacher and now journalist, and also one of the co-hosts of one of my favorite podcasts, which is the Conspirituality podcast. He's also the author of many books, his most recent being a group effort with his podcast hosts, Derek and Julian, called Conspirituality: How New Age Theories Become a Health Threat. He is joining us via Zoom all the way from Toronto. Hey, Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I would like to open up this discussion by pulling a tarot card for you if you're comfortable, and asking if you have a question. It can be general guidance. It can be specific if you have something you want to find out a little bit more about. Totally up to you.
Oh, so I have a question that I'm bringing to you, and you're gonna read a card. Okay.
If you're cool with that.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Okay, so
Put you on the spot.
you might have to edit out some of a pause here.
It's totally fine.
Let's see. Okay. Over the next 5 years for me, what genre of writing will be most effective for communicating what I would like to communicate?
Perfect. What genre? Let's have a look. Now, as a fellow writer, although not yet published author, fellow writer, I use the tarot all the time for my writing. It is a really good tool I don't know if it's something that you've ever utilized before.
Never, no. Although I did, I mean, we can get into it, but there was a time when I was actually quite far into Vedic astrology or East
Oh,
Indian astrology. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something that I would at some point love to study or at least learn more about. I find it so fascinating. Um, did you have a good experience with that?
Well, I had an interesting experience with it. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I mean, that could be its own episode, but I don't, I mean, suffice it to say, I don't do it anymore. And I much more prefer to kind of understand and interpret the signs of my life as they appear just in the material world at this point. Yeah.
Understood. Vedic
Yeah.
astrology, if anyone's unaware who's listening, that it can be very predictive. It is, I would say, one of the most predictive forms of astrology. I have a lot of friends who, one of my good friends is she grew up in Singapore. She's Tamil and she swears by her Vedic astrologer.
Right.
And a lot of the time she'll say, "Oh, I have to get back to you. I don't know if I can do that. I have to ask my astrologer first."
Right. Hmm.
I'm like,
Well, and that scales up in modern India even to the level
mhm.
of political decisions, planning out public events. In fact, Vedic astrology was implicated in one of the biggest super spreader events of COVID-19 in India because Narendra
Oh.
Modi actually took the advice of his astrologers over the epidemiologists in planning for a big religious festival that was to take place in 2022, but they actually bumped it up to 2021. So yeah, pretty complicated stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
I mean, that leads right into what we're going to be talking about
right.
specifically. But one other thing as well, I've noticed if anyone's watched things like Indian Matchmaker or anything like that, it plays a huge role in
Yeah.
people choosing who they're going to spend the rest of their lives with. So it's
Right.
it's a big cultural aspect. I
Hmm.
find it fascinating, but it's very different to modern astrology or anything people might have heard me doing before. Now, I've pulled a card for you today, and so usually I just pick a random deck depending on who I'm reading for. And today it felt very traditional, so I've gone with the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Now, this card, and again, if you're not familiar with them, this one is actually called the Lovers. So, what it looks like, we have these, it's very biblical Garden of Eden Genesis vibes, right? There's two naked people down the bottom of the card, and we have this big angelic figure in the sky behind them.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of people think this card is romance or true love, but it's not really the vibe of this card. That's more the Two of Cups. So romance is not the genre for you to go down, or just put that out there. In terms of what you're going to be writing or what to focus on in terms of the words to get the message out there the best. Firstly, this card's ruled by Gemini, and if you've done anything with astrology, you know that is very much about words, teaching, sharing in a way that is also quite relatable as well. So
Right.
bringing it to a way that everybody can understand and everyone can see themselves in it.
Right.
The other part of this card, there's a very big focus on both the word union and the word choices. Okay, so union obviously bringing two things together. So I would even suggest, in terms of ways you can meld the two different polar opposites, like the duality that you have in the things that you're talking about, especially if you're still going down the path of cults and conspirituality and all of that. So it encompasses religion, spirituality, health, science, psychology. It's a way to bring them all together in a way that's going to be very easy to understand. So, in a way that gives people an option that they can make a choice. So,
Right.
almost like clearing it up and giving them the
Hmm.
choice or the question there to help them question themselves. So, that to me could be writing something that has either sections where they could journal or sections where people could start to look at what they're believing or look at what they've fallen into with a really critical eye, but doesn't make them feel silly for doing so, if that makes sense.
Sure. All right. So accessibility and integration
Yes.
would be the two keywords. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll
definitely.
buy that. I think that resonates.
Yeah.
Well done. Well done. Thank you, Tarot Gods.
Oh, it's so fun. And if anyone is a writer, especially creative writing, so I do a lot of creative writing, every now and then I'll be writing a scene and need to put in a character, like just, oh, I need a character to come and bring in X, Y, and Z. Oh, what am I going to do? So I'll just pull a card and be like, oh, okay, this one, all right, might tell me whether they're male or female. It might tell me what their strengths or their weaknesses are. It can just be a really good, push to create something really interesting that I didn't think of before. So it's a really fun tool.
Well, two things that I'd say is that firstly, I think it's easy for me to find resonance in that particular card because I do have not, I mean, everybody has multiple sides, but I mean, I think two main personae that I have worked through in my professional life, writing wise, would be fiction and poetry earlier in my life, and then journalism more currently. And of course, I mean, at this point, I'm thinking about now I'm also a parent, and I'm thinking about, okay, well, what in the young adult sort of field would combine those particular worlds. And so young adult fiction is going to be accessible, and we have so yeah, it's a resonant card. And at the same time, I do want to say that if you had pulled another card,
It could
you
also
would
resonate.
you would have given a similarly evocative reading, and I would have said yes, that sounds resonant too, and I would have figured out how to make something work from your particular analysis. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's the tarot deck seems to be a pretty good icebreaker. So nice to meet you, and very, very happy to start.
Although if I'd pulled the Two of Cups and told you to go and write a romance novel, he may.
See, I don't think you would have told me to go write a romance novel, because that would have been very bold, right? I mean, because I think you know enough about my work so far that I think suggesting such an incredible shift would be. I mean, you might be that bold as a predictor. I don't know, but I think whatever you would have pulled, you would have used it to make a connection, and I think that's a point. I think that's the point. Yeah,
definitely. So when we're talking, so obviously your book is called Conspirituality, which is that a term that you and your co-host created? You made that word up?
No, the word is a portmanteau of conspiracy theorizing, and spirituality, and it's derived from, well, the theory behind it is derived from a paper that was published in 2011 by David Vos and Charlotte Ward. Charlotte Ward was an independent researcher in the UK. David Vos is I mean, I think he's in the UK mainly, but he's an American sociologist of religion. And they wrote a paper called The Emergence of Conspirituality, in which they argued that they were observing the emergence of a new form of kind of social movement that combined the paranoid and world negative points of view that are common within conspiracy theorizing with the aspirational or desire for the new world type of mood that characterizes the new age. They suggested that the conspiracy theorizing side of this social movement was coded male and quite cynical, and that speaking of the lovers, by the way, and that the new age side of the equation was coded female. And they said that it was an online movement. They said that the influencers that they were tracking were creating a kind of social and religious paradigm by which they could interpret catastrophic events in the world as holding great spiritual potential. And we took that term and we developed it through the research that we did for the podcast, to apply to some of the social media chaos that we saw exploding at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think how we've really developed the term is that we have argued that it really shows up, conspirituality shows up wherever, unrealistic new age spiritual beliefs intersect with a kind of paranoid conspiracy logic in response to a confusing and terrifying world. We've shown that conspirituality blurs the lines between doomsday prophecy, social media charisma, and alt health profiteering, and also claims of spiritual revelation. And we also characterize it as emotionally contagious, a kind of overreaction to real issues. So, conspirituality influencers and followers have legitimate concerns about the institutions that govern their lives, be they medical, political, technological, or financial. And the answers that they come up with for those concerns involve fantasies of spiritual warfare and heroism. So, parents who have very earnest questions about vaccine safety will become crusaders who are saving their children from, corrupt and vampiric doctors. And, citizens who have really good reason to doubt the integrity of mainstream media begin to turn to really dubious online sources for daily news. So there's also this aspect of conspirituality that involves the performance of a kind of priestly persona, that often the conspirituality influencer will present themselves as a shaman or a revolutionary, but at the same time, they're also like selling wellness and spiritual trinkets that will save the world that's in peril. And a lot of the time, and this is, I think, a key point, the success of conspirituality as a social movement and the influencers who run it really depends on how efficiently they can terrify their followers first, but then enchant them with the promises and products of transformation.
Yeah, it is such a complex and almost like rich topic.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Fascinating. And unfortunately, it does cross over into so many aspects. When you say new age, it doesn't even stay in just the new age section, but it spreads. I've seen it in the home birthing community, free birthing community, while pregnancy, it spreads through there, which then leads into this the witchcraft side of things, with very womb-centered witchcraft circles, and
Right.
they start to fire each other up, and then suddenly you're like, what happened? This started as one thing and now it's over here. And
Right. And with, let me just say that with home birthing, with free birthing or wild birthing, we follow a number of influencers who take a legitimate critique of overly intrusive medical interventionism during birth, who look at rates of induction, for example, or rates of cesarean section, or whatever metric they're using to describe a kind of over clinicalization of what they see as a very natural and miraculous activity, and they push that critique farther into, in the words of Yolande Norris Clark, into describing what they call the industrial gynecological complex, where doctors are actually gynecologists, especially, even if they're women, are actually engaged in, oppressing women's bodies through medical interventions, and that's the point. And it's not just that they're misguided; it's that the the medicalization of birth has the purpose of despiritualizing or depriving women of some sort of soul freedom, and that once they don't have the experience of natural childbirth, that somehow they won't have access to the rest of their spiritual life. And so it's a very radical kind of overreach with a particular critique that begins as legitimate and that adds a lot to feminist discourse, and then crosses over into this line of really sort of almost critical or urgent paranoia about what institutions are actually doing to us. So it's a great example. And I also want to say, this is what I left out of my little definitional riff, was that all of these influences tend towards right-wing politics in terms of how they express themselves in real-world attitudes towards policy. So this is also evident in home birthing and free birthing, and in discourses of wellness that are feminist because they center upon the essentialized power of a woman's body, or the power of the womb. That very easily bleeds over into a kind of gender essentialism that becomes the basis of a handshake between those communities and right-wing communities that are very concerned, for instance, about how trans people are ruining the world, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very common and disturbing part of our beat to cover the fact that um, almost all of these influences that are arguing on one hand for a more organic lifestyle and for an eschewing of medical interventions, and no, we don't need vaccines because we have natural immunity. A lot of those attitudes rhyme with quite right-wing attitudes and conservative attitudes about the essential nature of the body, and gender is part of that essentialism.
Yeah. And I see even that slippery slope if we stick with that birth community, because I myself was going for a home birth, and I started to see it was quite shocking the interesting intersectionality of people in those Facebook groups and things like that. But the
Right.
slippery slope of someone wanting to home birth, and usually they were either very Christian and conservative, or
Right.
this very new age type of person that was drawn to it. And very few of us were sort of this in the middle type of person, like what I found myself to be in
Right.
comparison. And then I found they all sort of ended up in this one section where they were not wanting to get birth certificates because they're sovereign beings. And it just went there so quickly, and they both started to agree. And I'm like, this is strange. Don't know what's happening.
Yeah, and that is an amazing sort of narrative pathway that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
because what you have is the values of home birthing suddenly becoming transitive and politicized to all of these other areas of life, um, and that the symbology of birthing your child outside of the medical complex becomes analogous to birthing your child outside of the reach of the state.
Mm-hmm.
That the child is not actually going to be a participant within a worldly community, that the child is going to be free, they're going to be sovereign. And this brings up another aspect of the politics of conspirituality, which tends towards not only right-wing attitudes but also very libertarian approaches towards um, you know individual rights, the rights of the home, and a kind of sort of rejection of the notion of mutual aid, or the fact that we live in a society at all, and that we have to share a monetary system, and we have to share governments, and we have to do public policy together. Conspiritualists on the hard right end of the spectrum really don't want to have anything to do with any of that stuff, because the way in which problems in the world will get fixed is going to be through spirituality, not through cooperation, not through democracy, not through any kind of method that would denigrate the notion that their spirituality answers every question. That's a crucial thing for them, is that the ideas that you hold dear about the unity of all things, or the sacredness of the earth, or the holiness of your own body, that those ideas have to trump everything else. And that's why something like vaccine science is so difficult for some of these people to accept, because the vaccine is not a bespoke, like individualized treatment according to your temperament or your doshas or some shit like that. It's zero point 0.5 milliliters of a single fluid that everybody in the world can benefit from, regardless of their blood type, or their astrological sign, or their whatever their what are the uh what's the Taoist thing with the lines? What is that? Enneagram, right?
Oh, Enneagram,
it's
yeah.
like there is no vaccine for a particular Enneagram, right? Everybody gets the same thing. And that speaks to the kind of homogenization of a public health approach that is very, very insulting to the individualist, to the libertarian, and also to the person who economically makes their living by creating bespoke treatments for each individual person, right? So there's a lot going on there, and I also think that just to extend that a little bit, that it's the individualism that makes people within the conspirituality demographic very attracted to the notion that, for instance, I don't need to mask myself during a pandemic because I know that I'm okay. I know that my breath is clean. I know that I can heal myself by doing deep breathing exercises. You can't tell me when I'm sick. I'm so self-aware that, there's no point in me wearing a mask because if I was sick, then I would know it and I would take care of myself. And that just is not how viruses work. You just do not know when you're infectious in the first several days, depending upon what the virus is. But that really is offensive to the libertarian and to the individualist sensibility, the person who really depends on this notion that I am sovereign, I know my body, no one else can know my body better than I do. Well, let me tell you about, oncology, because some people know your body at certain points in your life better than you do, and that's just the way it is. And if you don't kind of like accept that, you won't be able to benefit from appropriate treatment.
Absolutely. And when things start to tend towards that right side, the right political side, what is the difference between it just being right leaning and becoming alt right? Like, where is the line, or where is that step across?
Well, I think alt-right is a term that we have used on the podcast previously. I think it's a little bit, it might be a little bit outdated at this point because it really dates back to about 2008. I think it's coined by Richard Spencer, who's like the neo-Nazi guy, the white nationalist, who was trying to create a category for openly white supremacist and radically pro-capitalist thought and sentiment that went farther than typical right-wing media. So I think that maybe the question is about, or maybe, I think you're asking a good question, but I would refine it to say that there is a natural tendency for people involved in conspirituality to simply be magnetized towards conservative modes of thought, unless they have some sort of prior analysis or political training that will give them some resistance to that. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is about how the yoga, wellness, and New Age communities since the 1970s have been actively engaged in a kind of self-depoliticization, a kind of the notion that, I'm above the battleground. I may vote, I may not vote, but actually voting isn't going to be what changes the world. I have to embody the change that I want to see in the world. Right and left don't really mean anything, because I can bring my two hands together and namaste and everything will be better. There's this whole feeling of politics is this dirty, mundane, worldly, unenlightened activity, and I'm going to be above it. And if I meditate on non-duality, then I don't have to take this path or that path. And so that's been sort of like a drumbeat underneath yoga, wellness, and New Age culture for at least 40 or 50 years. And what that means is that when right-wing ideologies like QAnon swing through the yoga world in 2019, 2020, people don't have any resistance to it. They don't recognize that what they're seeing is an emergent fascist mythology that wants to persecute and kill deviant liberals, including homosexuals and trans people, that wants to sort of prosecute political enemies by calling them pedophiles, they don't really see that what they are engaged with is not really a spirituality at all, but it's a hard right ideology. Now, your question was like, how does the person within this world like go from right leaning to a hard right politics? Well, maybe that line we can say is really where they cross over into a kind of activism, which is kind of hard to sort of assess because so much of this activity is on social media, so much of it is gamified. And so, as soon as a person starts, I don't know, tending towards a politics that might not be native to them, that might not have anything to do with their family values growing up, that might not have anything to do with their class position within the society and their class interests, they might begin to share those materials online, and they might do it in a way that puts out feelers like, I'm starting to wonder, or I'm just asking questions about whether Donald Trump might be a light worker, or whether he's actually been sent to disrupt the status quo between left and right, because everybody's up in arms, and a little bit of churning the soup isn't bad, of course. But then the person in the yoga, wellness, or new age communities can make that political turn a part of their brand, right? An example that I'm thinking about is a fairly sort of small level operator named Bernard Gunther, who's like a massage therapist, but also like a new age teacher in, I don't know, Sedona or somewhere like that, Taoist, something like that. And he went from, teaching kind of new age courses about awakening and consciousness and the new paradigm and this and that, to writing a 24,000 word novella about whether or not QAnon was a real thing. And, spoiler alert, he believes that it is, or he did at least 2 years ago. And at that point, the influencer becomes a political actor, much more than somebody who infuses their wellness products with politics. The politics become the point. And I think for some people, this is very attractive because what they were doing in yoga, wellness, and new age discourse was kind of boring to them, to be frank, right? Like they got to the point where they had just made too many posts about green smoothies. They had made too many posts about the breathwork workshop that was going to rebirth their new consciousness. Now suddenly they had something political to obsess about, and to really make good on the mantra of being the change they wanted to see in the world. They could now go out to protests. They could now wave signs that would save the children. They could now feel like they were political actors. And I think that's a very, very powerful feeling for people.
Yeah, absolutely. With yoga, wellness, religion, spirituality, whether it's witchcraft or Christianity even, because it comes from both sides, what is it that about being in these communities or being in these spiritual belief groupings that leads people down the garden path to essential oils curing cancer and elite bloodlines are controlling humanity? What do you think it is that makes people susceptible to that level of thinking?
Well, I'll get to the pseudoscience in a moment, but I would say that the crossover that I think is very powerfully explained comes to us through the work of the political scientist Michael Barkun, who says that the conspiracy theorist is the person who fervently believes that everything is connected, nothing is as it seems, and everything happens for a purpose. Now, your listeners might hear those three phrases and go, "Oh, right. Those sound like good things."
Yeah,
that's exactly, that's what I think. And so you should, because those three principles are at the heart of a lot of global spiritualities. Nothing is as it seems. everything is connected and everything happens for a purpose. These are very aspirational and positive qualities, and yet Michael Barkun is using them to describe how conspiracy theories form. Well, it's Charlotte Ward and David Voas in that article from 2011 who point out that both communities use these principles as sort of articles of faith to describe a world that they are seeking to have a certain kind of control over in terms of how they interpret it. It's a way of creating a story about the world that gives a sense of empowerment and safety, and then also community with others who think the same way. And one of the things that that leads to is a strong sense of contrarianism. So if nothing is as it seems, then why would you believe public health officials? If everything is connected, why wouldn't you see the sort of spurious relationship between vaccines and autism? If everything happens for a purpose, why wouldn't you understand COVID as an opportunity rather than as a disaster, right? And I think where pseudoscience slips in is that these three principles also promote the notion of a kind of stigmatized knowledge, which is another Barkun term. And what he means by that is people can feel very excited and empowered by the notion that they know something that nobody else doesn't, and that they know something that is actually being suppressed by the powers that be, right? And so, it's very attractive for a person to begin to believe that their essential oils are going to be very effective against COVID because they've already decided that the public health advice is untrustworthy and that vaccines are linked to autism. It must be that they're suppressing the true value of thieves' oil or tea tree oil in combating the virus. And yeah, I think the step is not that hard to make. Mm-hmm. There's a feeling of distrust and contrarianism that morphs into a kind of replacement faith for something that is equally implausible, right? It's like what's the evidence for thieves' oil being, effective against COVID? Well, there isn't any, except for my own sense of kind of like tuned inness and spiritual correctness and my own self-certainty, my own standing in my truth, the fact that I did my own research. So there are a lot of aspects of kind of empowerment that go along with this feeling of stigmatized knowledge of this thing that you know and nobody else does, and you have access to because you're a good spiritual person.
Yeah, I've noticed one other thing as well in a lot of the online group spaces in regards to things like essential oils or other natural alternatives that the government has no control over.
Yeah.
Example, what I believe is that a lot of people who may not have it as a cure, who may have tried it and it didn't work, really, really hesitant to share that. Or if they do, their post gets deleted, that sort of a thing. There's this almost like fear of being the one person not promoting that if it doesn't actually work. So all you end up seeing is all the positives, like, oh my gosh,
yes,
this person used it and they were healed and they were saved. And it's like, well, there is placebo, that's a thing. And then also maybe, they got better. And we see that, I think, as well in miracles being performed, whether that is in Christianity or whether that is in something like a Joe Dispenza meditation that somebody gets.
Absolutely. You're saying something very, very important, which is that the miracle reports and the testimonials are an essential part of the marketing technique for the actual product. We actually covered this very heartbreaking story of a woman named Faye, who an Australian actually named Gavin Ryan, who's an artist there. I can't remember whether he's from Sydney or from what's the famous like New Age place? Not Bondi, but Oh, Byron Bay. That's right. He's from he's from Byron Bay. Anyway, he went to Bali because he was seeking out wood carvers for a particular project, and he met this woman. They fell in love. She was a yoga teacher. She was from Indonesia. Her family was in Jakarta, and they had this like wonderful relationship for a couple of years, and then she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And her yoga pathway for her had been so powerful and helpful in freeing herself and helping her heal from a very bad prior relationship. And it had helped her with her self-image in a number of different ways. And she's also in Ubud, right? Which is kind of like, yoga capital of the world. And she's surrounded by people who are reading all of this stuff, and Western medicine is this kind of stigmatized thing off to the side. And she delayed seeking treatment. Also, well, it's not just that she delayed seeking treatment, but she went to a proper oncologist who gave her a very stern and dire prognosis and said, this is the radical treatment that we advise you pursue, and we advise that you do it immediately because this can get very serious. She didn't like his manner. She didn't like the sort of zero-sum prognosis. And instead of getting a second opinion or finding somebody with a better bedside manner, she decided, in sort of alignment with her culture and the values that she was surrounded by, that all doctors are like that, and they all just want to give you double mastectomies, and and chemotherapy is going to ruin your life, and it's poison, and they don't know what they're talking about, and you can heal yourself with this energy work and those herbs, and and then she gets into things like black salve. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's like a caustic that people have been using for tumors ineffectively and disastrously for over 100 years, and it just eats away your flesh. And as it eats away your flesh, all of this like goop comes out that the healer will claim is then the tumor being excised, and of course it's bullshit. She just delays treatment, and she eventually, they wind up back in Australia, and she's able to benefit from some good oncology, but like the doctors sort of see her coming in the door, and she's incredibly ill, and it's incredibly advanced, and they're trying to do what they can. And she participates a little bit in that. And of course, her husband is just trying to be supportive of this person's, of Faye's love for this material, and her her deeply held beliefs about her capacity to heal her own body. And it just it's such an incredibly tragic story, because all that she got from her Facebook groups were the miracle stories, which is what your question was about. There was nobody who followed up with, I tried these herbs for 6 months, and I actually, I went from stage 2 to stage 4 in the particular cancer that I had. Or actually, no, this didn't, cure my diabetes. And in fact, I went into, insulin shock. And
what it does as well, when
yeah.
they then see that everyone else it's working for, it's not working for me, it must be my fault. I'm not.
Yes, exactly. That's the only option. That's the only option. And it that's a very powerful control mechanism within these groups that polices people's actual sort of honest observations of what the thing is doing for them. And it's a very old principle that dates right back to, it goes right back to New Thought in the 1920s, and Helena Blavatsky, and Christian Science. And then it has this lineage that goes forward into Louise Hay and You Can Heal Your Life. And then that's all wrapped up in, things like A Course in Miracles.
Yes, which I did want to talk about as well. With all of that, though, all of that material can be seen as incredibly ableist. Which
Absolutely.
it boils my blood. Like, beside the point. With A Course in Miracles, now that is one topic that I get a lot of questions about. I personally have steered well clear of it because I listen to you guys, so I know not to go there. But I have a lot of either my followers or even friends that swear by A Course in Miracles
Yeah.
and say it's changed their life. And I wanted to ask specifically, because you guys do talk about it quite a lot on the podcast, what is it about A Course in Miracles that makes it so problematic?
Well, first of all, I would say to anybody listening who feels that the course has changed their life, everything that I say that follows, I don't want to take any of that away from you, but I would suggest that um, there might be an attribution issue going on that often, and this is true of any spiritual practice, often when people say, yoga changed my life, or this diet changed my life, or this particular book changed my life. Often what's happening is maybe under the influence of the marketing of that particular product, or maybe because, there just seems to be such a strong correlation. What often is getting left out is that when you started going to yoga, you started feeling less isolated. When you started going to yoga, it was the first exercise that you'd had in a long time. and any kind of exercise might have had the same impact.
And as we know, endorphins make you happy, as Al
Exactly.
Woods will tell us.
Right. And that it can also be that when you changed your diet a little bit, it got you thinking differently about, whether or not you were worthy of care, right? And that itself can have really strong positive psychological effects. And so I would say that, yeah, it's possible. It's very, very a real experience that people say that the Course in Miracles changed their life. I would say that a non-devotional, very kind of literary savvy and comparative reading of the text shows that it has some pretty nasty qualities that you may have sort of overlooked in favor of the general feeling of certainty and clarity that the voice purports to have, because of course, the voice is supposed to be that of Jesus, but it's not the Jesus you grew up with. It's a new age Jesus. It's a different kind of Jesus. So first of all, I mean, the claim, let's just start there. The claim is that A Course in Miracles was channeled directly from Jesus by a clinical psychologist named Helen Schucman starting in 1965. And most course students will maintain a kind of faith in this one-to-one accurate transmission of the channeled voice. But what they may not know is that the first notes that come out of this project, which I think was kind of like an entranced writing project, like as a writer, it's not surprising to me that somebody feels possessed by a particular voice or a kind of diction for a number of years and then just keeps writing on it. Like I've written whole novels like that, and Jesus wasn't talking to me. And what people should understand is that her first notes were so obviously about her own concerns and neuroses. The Jesus in the first versions of A Course in Miracles is homophobic, is sort of super Freudian, but also anti-Freudian in the sense that, he really wants to assert that God has more answers than psychology does. There are all kinds of sort of inside baseball discussions of which therapists are better and whether Jung is better than, Otto Rank or whatever. And that all gets edited by people who have, very strong motivations to produce what ends up feeling like a kind of scriptural text, complete with iambic pentameter, and with all of the dodgy, more, obviously politically incorrect stuff ironed out. And it proposes that it is a non-dualistic update to Christianity. And what I mean by that is that it suggests that salvation is always already our natural state, and here's where the self-blame comes in. If we don't perceive ourselves as being one with God at all times, it's simply because we are delusional. We're dreaming a dream. And, this isn't an original message. It kind of appropriates some very old principles from Indian philosophy. In fact, I don't think that it would have been as popular as it was, or it has been, if it didn't sort of commit this final colonial act of Western Orientalism to absorb a kind of Indian metaphysics into a Christian narrative. But that absorption means that a number of aspects of Christian theology get kind of knocked down. For instance, the Course in Miracles suggests that the crucifixion, the whole history of Jesus, was a kind of illusory play put on for children. Jesus didn't really take birth to suffer and die alongside human beings, as most theologies would have it. Rather, Jesus is supposed to realize a final lesson in the illusory nature of the body, and the illusory nature of death. Now, all of that might be okay, but the surrounding sort of context of it is this notion that everything is in your mind. And this makes it a very solipsistic and individualistic text that generally disconnects people from their material considerations. It generally depoliticizes students of the course. It makes them feel as though they, that everything is already okay, that any war or strife or conflict in the world that they see is actually a projection of their own inner confusion. And that leads to a kind of, I would argue, a kind of narcissistic spirituality that really doesn't reach outside of itself to wonder about, how one's spirituality can be formed in relation to other people or in relation to projects of mutual aid. And this is what makes the candidacy of Marianne Williamson so incredibly, in the States, so incredibly strange, because in the morning, she is teaching things like sickness is a defense against the truth, or I am not a body, I am free. And in the afternoon, she's talking about progressive ideals like, slavery reparations, or, free healthcare, universal healthcare. And so on one side, there's a progressive kind of, I would say, a veneer to Williamson's messaging that she doesn't really have. I would say she doesn't really have the political experience to enact. But on the base level, there's this kind of metaphysical belief in the power of the mind over everything else, which leads her to do things like, on March 20th, 2020, like 9 days after the WHO declares a pandemic, she goes on Facebook Live and she tells people that they can do a meditation on light pouring through their bodies, and that will boost their immune systems. And that's not a thing, right? Like you can meditate all you want, and the novel coronavirus doesn't give a shit. Like it just will not care how much you've meditated. It will enter your cells and it will fuck shit up, and that's it. And it's not like she's a regular religious leader where she's saying, we really want to remember in our hour of existential need that there's a larger picture, or that, the arc of justice bends towards, or the arc of history bends towards justice. It's more like, you have the power of God in your body, and you can use your breath to boost your immune system and help push away the virus. And those are two very different religious approaches to political activity. And I would just say that anybody who thinks that A Course in Miracles is a viable social document is not really getting that it really is solipsistic, that it really just does focus on what you do inside your own thoughts as a means for salvation.
It's very, two things. Her light meditation is giving me very Anthony Williams medical media.
Yeah, except that you're supposed to like just take showers and celery juice, right?
But calling in the light, and Very
Like
much.
you actually visualize yourself as a juicer with the blades on the top of your head, and you just
I
like
am the
just press the celery stalks down through your crown chakra, and then it just sort of. And do you like you poop out the fiber, but the green juice just fills you up, and that's great.
and all
That
the
is that what he
fiber
does?
is just a skeleton. It's you don't need it. Don't worry about it.
You don't need it. You don't need it, right? Yeah.
With things like A Course in Miracles, would you call that text a cult? Would it be cult-like, culty?
Um, no, I would say that it's a text that can foster cultic environments, but anything really can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that the dynamics of cultism can really emerge in any social dynamic. And so, I would say that there's a kind of entrancing and narcissistic quality to A Course in Miracles that probably more than other spiritual texts gets people into a pattern by which they can, what do you call it? A pattern by which they can really remove themselves from social concern and not pay attention to what's happening around them. At the same time, it's not like A Course in Miracles has been very efficient at organizing social groups. I mean, but I'm saying that as somebody who was in A Course in Miracles cult for 3 years. So it does happen. It's just not that common.
Yeah.
I would say that, cult discourse has moved from analyzing brick and mortar groups that have very sort of predictable recruitment patterns and home bases and physical assets in the 1970s and 80s. Everyone from or everything from the People's Temple to Rajneeshpuram to Shambhala International to a more online medium in which the dynamism of charismatic leadership, for example, can be performed and broadcast, but the more sort of concrete elements of social and behavioral control that cults foster, that's a little bit harder to do. If you're in Rajneeshpuram in 1980 in Oregon, when you're getting up every day, what you're supposed to be wearing, when you're supposed to go to a group meditation that's basically a hazing practice. When you're going to be going to the lectures and when you're going to be working in the soup kitchen. If you follow a charismatic leader in the age of internet cults, those behavioral issues are a lot harder to enforce, or those norms are harder to enforce. And I would say that the retention that leaders have over followers is also weaker. So there's something more entrepreneurial about it. There's something more about being obsessed with subscribers and subscriber count. And I think everybody who runs kind of online cultic environments, I would give Teal Swan as an example here. They don't really have to stress too much about whether the 120 people at their ashram are all in or not. They have to think more about, are they losing 10%, or gaining 10% in any given month of their hundreds of thousands of YouTube followers. And that's a very different proposition. But that said, the same kind of charismatic techniques apply, making huge unevidenced claims based on some sort of miraculous backstory of having survived cosmic abuse, and then kind of presenting oneself as being a prophet or a seer who knows the truth about everything all the time. So the techniques are the same, but the milieu is different, and I think cult theorists are still figuring that out.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when you think of cult, like technically, I go, oh, Jonestown, that was a cult.
Yeah, right.
We can see that very clearly. But I think these days, as you said, those lines are a lot fuzzier. But the influence of having someone say, hey, drink this Kool-Aid. Well, I know it wasn't Kool-Aid. It was, I think it was a different brand name, but it was the same
I'm
idea.
glad that you know. I'm glad that you know that that was wrong, and also that drinking the Kool-Aid is kind of a fucked up thing to say because
Yes,
it's
it
a
really is.
joke. It's the joke at the expense of 800 dead people, including a bunch of children. Yeah,
Yes. And a lot of them were forced to, they didn't just willingly do it.
I
However,
know, I know, and some of them were shot in the back of the head too.
yeah, however, the
Right,
idea that someone could have that form of influence to say, hey, drink this thing that I made of unknown things that we don't really know where it came from, and this will clear you of all your toxins, or this will deworm you. And
right.
people would do that. They have that really far-reaching influence and the charisma, and it's control, but it's less physical. It's in the tech space. It's on the internet. But I still
Right.
think that influence is there, and that potential for damage of people just flowing with it and doing whatever they say is really.
Yeah, the reach is broader, the effects are milder, but there's much more wasted time in aggregate, right? It's like because if Jim Jones winds up killing over 800 people, but Anthony Williams ends up, mystifying millions with and imagine the hours of life. I mean, I'm not comparing him to a murderer, of course, but I'm saying that I would say that like if you offer millions of people, if you convince millions of people to do something that is actually full of shit, you're wasting their time. You are wasting their not just their time, but their emotional commitment and energy. You're wasting their capacity for figuring out their own problems using proper resources. You're wasting I think there's a very American attitude of like, oh, let people do what they want to do. Let them and sure, of course, ultimately that's going to be how things shake out. But I do wish that people took a little bit more seriously, like how much time is wasted by the influencer who convinces a million people that celery juice will cure their diabetes. Because it's not just that they will delay medical treatment, it's also that they will just spend time wrapped up in somebody else's charismatic bullshit. And that's not fair. Like time is the thing that we have, and it shouldn't be stolen by people who are making shit up.
And he's very
There's
clever with the
Pardon
celery.
me?
He's clever because a lot of people go, oh, it's celery juice, it's not going to hurt you. But if you dive
It,
deeper, then he
right,
starts talking about, cloud seeding and
right.
all it gets pretty intense. And a lot of what he says is actually very, very dark and fear mongering.
Yeah, right.
Never tuned into his lives, like they are scary, and he's scaring people about all the stuff that's coming and how we have to focus on the light because this horrible stuff is going to come with political stuff. Like he has this facade of just being the
Right.
summary guy, but it does get dark.
Right. And let me just maybe we can finish by saying that this is like a key thing to look out for when you are negotiating these spaces is if somebody is promising something in one hand but scaring the shit out of you with the other, they are creating a cultic dynamic in the sense that they are being a caregiver who is also a terrorizer, a person who invents the problem that they are going to solve, and that can create something that is known in relational psychology as trauma bonding. It can create something called disorganized attachment. There's a great book by Alexandra Stein called Love and Brainwashing, or Love, Terror, and Brainwashing, that I would recommend everybody read. But I just as a basic principle, I would say that if somebody is promising you the moon, but they've got a knife behind their back, and they show it from time to time, and they say, the world's going to hell in the handbasket, or 5G is going to turn you into a human antenna, or the vaccine is going to make your kid autistic, and so here, buy my herbs. That's a double message of peril and saviorship, and that is inconsistent. It's megalomaniac, and you should be able to spot it from a mile away. It's not that hard. It's the sign of somebody who really doesn't give a shit about you. What they want to do is they want to sell their thing, and they're going to scare you into doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And with your book that you guys have written, would you say that's something that is a good, I guess, guide to spotting these red flags in influences?
I would say so. I mean, we cover in the third part, we cover 10 of the most prolific conspirituality influencers, and we describe exactly what they do. So I think that can I tell you the 10?
I'm going to guess.
Yeah, let me find the list here. You know what? I'm not going to say it because people can buy the book. But Christiane Northrup's on the list. So is Mickey Willis. So is Zach Bush. So is Kelly Brogan and Sayer G. And so is Guru Jagat, the late Guru Jagat.
Okay, awesome. Well, if anyone is interested in purchasing your book, so it's just come out the week that this podcast is due to come out. So in June 13th. So where is the best place for them to buy? Is it going to be on Amazon? Will there be Kindle edition? All the things?
It will be anywhere you can get books. Try to go to a local bookseller if you can. There's also an audiobook that's available through Audible or any other audiobook seller. And ebook edition should be available wherever you get those, and it's widely accessible. It's published by Hachette and Public Affairs, so it's all over the world. It's published in Canada and wait a minute, is it published just in Canada or Canada and Australia by Penguin Random House?
It would be Penguin Random House, yeah.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, you'll find it. It's not hard to find, and we'll give a link in the show notes.
Perfect. And if anyone wants to get in touch with, the things that you guys do or follow you along on social media, where can they find you?
Well, conspirituality.net has a contact form for the three of us, and then I can be reached through my Twitter handle or my own personal website, matthewremski.com.
Perfect. And I'll pop all of that in the show notes below as well. Thank you very much for joining me and chatting all things conspirituality. It's fascinating and a topic I'm sure you and I could both talk on for hours, but I appreciate your time. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Have a great day. Bye. All right, everyone. Wasn't that a very enlightening episode? I hope you were taking notes because he is just a wealth of knowledge, isn't he? So one thing I really wanted to talk about was a couple of people in the witchcraft, occult, New Age community who I have seen some of this stuff happening with. Now, the first one is someone called Georgina Rose, who goes by Dat Darling. Now, Georgina is a Thalamite, and Thelema is a Western esoteric and occult, either social or spiritual philosophy. It's like a new religious movement that was founded by Aleister Crowley. So if you know much about Aleister Crowley, maybe I should do a mini-sode on him. He's a little bit infamous. He wasn't the greatest guy, but it spawned a group of people, and a lot of them are often hitting back on like, oh, okay, just because he was bad doesn't mean all of us are bad. However, she was then, so Georgina Rose was then outed, and it all happened on Twitter, it all went down last year. She was outed as a presumed neo-Nazi with ties to Operation Werewolf. And a lot of her comments and her Twitter discourse and that sort of thing went into this traditional gender role stuff. It was weird. There's been a few weird things there. I'm actually going to put a link if you want to read more about that whole debacle, because I know she had a huge following. She still has a huge following, and over on YouTube she gets thousands and thousands of views every video she puts up, and I'm like, did people not know that she's possibly a neo-Nazi? Like, I don't want to put that on her because it's still kind of she hangs around with neo-Nazis, let's say that. It just baffles me. And then I see a lot of people referencing things like blood libel, the elite, the 13 bloodlines that rule the earth, and reptilian overlords, which leads all back into a lot of the stuff that David Icke spouts. And if anyone keeps up with my Instagram stories, you may have recalled when I decided to pick up a David Icke book, literally for shits and giggles. I could not finish it. I literally could not. I was like, this is so terrible. I took it back to my library and I told them they needed this book off their shelves. Now, I'm not usually one for like book banning sort of stuff, but it was very white supremacy based. And then once I started to actually research it afterwards, because in my head I was like, oh, he thinks the Queen's a lizard person, ha ha ha. No, it was so much darker than that. Like, yes, he thinks that, but his rationale behind it all leads into white supremacy. He is a Holocaust denier, and it's anti-Semitic. It is horrid. It's a horrible, horrible book. I would presume all of his books are like that. To the point where he went, I think recently, tried to go to Canada to give a talk, and once people found out there, they actually barred him from entry. Like, he's really not a great guy. Yet a lot of his ideas I actually see in other witchcraft, occult, esoteric books and people, and they might not be as outright as reptilian overlords, but there's like elements of some of the stuff he says, which leads into Lemuria, Atlantis, those like real new agey, and this is kind of where I almost separate the witchcraft to new age when it starts getting into Atlantis and Lemuria territory and starseed vibes. Like, a lot of that echoes what he says in his books. Now, I actually opened the podcast with a question around this because one area I notice the overlap of witchcraft community meets far-right conspiracy, as we talked about, was the womb-centered women's work, women's circles. Now, I'm a fan of women's circles. I am a fan of what some people deem women's mysteries. You would have potentially heard my podcast episode with Dr. Danielle Arabina, and there is a time and place for that. However, where it gets problematic for me is A, if they're trans exclusionary, or B, if you have a look on my website, I have a blog. Did you know I have a blog? I have a blog. And I do a lot of reviews of books. And I did a critical review of a book called Blood Magic by Jane Hardwicke Collins, who is a celebrated Australian author. I have actually never seen anyone speak a bad word about her, ever. And she calls herself a shaman and runs womancraft style circles. Now, I've tried to look up why she calls herself a shaman, because there is something about white women calling themselves a shaman that have no Indigenous links that just rubs me the wrong way. And she says that she was initiated into being a shaman by this random person that I cannot find anywhere on the internet. So, strange. Now, one of the main critiques of that book, because a lot of the information in that book was actually kind of good, right? It wasn't too bad. However, she frequently quotes someone called Christiane Northrup, who you may have heard Matthew and I talking about. And she quotes her as a recommended resource in every single podcast and interview that she does. A quick Google search will show you that. And I'm not one to just jump on and make a harsh judgment about someone. So I literally went to her and I was like, hey, do you promote her still? I see that you have, but are you aware of the stuff she's doing at the moment? Because Christiane Northrup is very blood libel, anti-Semitic, sort of those David Icke views, right? She's also like anti-mammograms and just some really, she's had her medical license revoked. She's not a great person. And so I asked Jane Hardwicke Collins, and she said, whilst I don't necessarily agree with her current perspective, I still do value her valuable contributions to women's health. And personally, to me, that still sounds like an endorsement of someone who is increasingly anti-Semitic and shares dangerous health advice. And I just can't get behind that. And I think that is where this blend comes in, and it is sometimes really subtle. And when we were talking about Anthony Williams and the celery juice thing, personally, I have tried the celery juice thing. And I went into it like I did with the David Icke book and everything. I went into it very, I'm not gullible, but I am open-minded. I'm willing to be like, lots of people are doing this thing. Let's just check it out. I'll see for myself. I would rather see for myself than have people tell me something is problematic or bad. I'm like, well, let me see what I think, right? And I flicked through a couple of his books, and he has a lot of stuff on migraines. You guys know I get chronic migraines. And I was like, you know what? I'll try just the celery juice and see if it helps. And you know what? After 3 months of drinking that damn stuff every morning, I actually felt so much worse. I had no energy. It was giving me stomach cramps. It was not a good thing. And I actually went onto one of those Facebook groups, and this is where that comment came in. And I said, I'm not noticing any difference. If anything, I'm worse. And the comments that came back were, "You're just detoxing. That's a detox symptom. Ramp it up and stick with it." Very not good advice. And the second one, "You're not doing it good enough. You haven't gone all in. And you need to do X, Y, and Z," like very restrictive diet changes. And I'm like, you know what? If it was as miraculous as he says, then just doing this one thing should have at least shown some difference, and it hasn't in the positive, and I've given it a good go. So I just kind of went, you know what? I'm going to stop. And it wasn't until I tried it, went into the Facebook groups, read the books, that I started to see his darker side to a lot of the stuff that he promotes. And you guys know me, I'm a human design profile 1-3, right? That I'm a line 1-3. That means 1, I want to have all of the knowledge before I say anything. And that's why I usually try things before I actually give I will never tell you a book is good until I've actually read it, or that it's bad until I've actually read it. I want to know all the things so I don't get it wrong. And then number 3 is about experiencing. And that means I usually learn things the hard way. But it leads into number 1 and helps me give really good advice. And I know a lot of the stuff I'm talking about because I've done the thing, right? So I want you guys to come away from this episode, A, with more critical thinking around, questioning some of the stuff that you might believe or the people that you follow. B, I actually highly recommend the Conspirituality podcast, and you guys go and have a listen. Just pick the ones that, they're talking about Russell Brand. I like Russell Brand. Let me listen to that one and just see what they say and listen with an open mind. Because they are very, as you can tell with Matthew, very, very well-educated, well-spoken, and they know what they're talking about. But at the same time, if you have, picked up A Course in Miracles or jumped on the celery juice trend, don't feel bad about it, right? I've done it. It doesn't mean that you're an idiot. They prey on people, and particularly myself having chronic migraines, you get desperate. You try, and I've tried the weirdest freaking shit, just thinking maybe it will help. The only thing I haven't gone into, there's this woman who she says she has the migraine cure. I should know that that's a big bad buzzword, but I looked it up and it looked pretty legit. She's got all these qualifications. But her prescription for people with migraines, she says that they can't eat any vegetables or fruit or gluten. It's literally an all meat diet, carnivore completely. Obviously, I was like, that's one thing I'm not trying. I would rather have migraines. That sounds horrendous and it sounds really unhealthy. And then she also makes people drink salt water 8 times a day. Not quite for me. That's one where I've crossed the line. But everything else I've tried. And I'll try a mix of Western, Eastern, unusual energy healing sessions, sound healing sessions, Reiki, kinesiology, chiro, herbal healing, herbalism. And then I've got a neurologist as well at the same time. I've got both sides. At the time of recording, I am trying traditional Chinese medicine, and we're just going to see how that goes. And this is not me hey, tell me all the things to try, because I've probably tried them all. You may even know I had my tongue tie released in 2021. Yeah, I think that's what it was. And unfortunately, whilst it did stop them for about 6 months, it grew back and made them worse because scar tissue is more restrictive. But I'm also not one to just sit down and just let them happen. I have to do something about it and try. Always trying. Can't lose hope. Otherwise it gets overwhelming. All of that ramble to just let you know that it's okay to be taken in by these. But also, if you can bring yourself out and if you can use your critical thinking, that's going to help you so much more in the long run. And if you guys ever see me doing stuff that you're like, Hannah, that's a bit problematic, or that could be ableist or transphobic or anything like that, you know that that is so not what I'm about. So please call me out on it. Absolutely. I am always open to learning, and I would really hope that that's not anything I ever do. And if I do, it would be unintentional. But again, impact over intent. So that is my random ramblings at the end of this episode, because there was a lot to say and we didn't have all the time in the world, but I wanted to get a couple of those stories out there for you all. As usual, if you would like to book in with myself, you can do so at suburbanwitchery.com. You'll also find me on social media as Suburban Witchery on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and over on Twitter, I'm Hana the SW. We also have our podcast Instagram called @WitchTalksPodcast, which is where I post all of the graphics so you can see what's coming up and all other fun stuff related to the podcast specifically. I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are in the world today. and I'll chat with you next time.